Okay, welcome back once again. In 1992, India's stock market crashed in a single day and wiped out the saving of millions of ordinary people. Behind it all was one man. Harshad Mehta grew up poor in a small town, no connections, no advantage, just an extraordinary mind for number and hunger for money that never quite. He moved to Mumbai, talked his way into the stock market, and slowly became the most powerful broker in India. People called him the Big Bull. When he spoke, the market moved, but his empire was built on a lie. He had been quietly stealing billions from banks using fake documents and pumping that money into stock to make himself look like a genius. For years, nobody caught him. Nobody can looked until one journalist did one article one morning and it all came crashing down. This is not just a story about one man greed. It is a story about a system that looked the other way, about regulators who were asleep, about ordinary people who lost everything and were never compensated, and about a country that kept repeating the same mistakes again and again, even after Harshad was gone. He died in jail in 2001. 26 out of his 26, 27 criminal cases were still pending when he took his last breath. But the question he left behind is still unanswered.
In 1954, inside a small house in Rajkot, a child was born into a world of fixed boundaries. He was not a top student. He moved through his early years without academic distinction. He lacked any obvious natural gifts. There was no specific talent that set him apart from the children in his neighborhood. His family lived without wealth. There were no financial reserves or family assets to provide a head start. In the mid-century Indian economy, this combination, average grades, no distinct talent, and no capital, meant a life of permanent obscurity was almost mathematically guaranteed. The people around him lived with a sense of resignation. They expected to remain in the same social stratum for their entire lives. It was a world of small parameters. Success was measured in small jobs, modest expectations, and predictable, quiet lives. Without external resources or elite connections, there was no clear path to escape these surroundings. This environment functioned as a psychological vacuum. It was designed to ensure that ambition remained local and contained. But inside this vacuum, a single anomaly developed. He possessed a specific drive that functioned like a physical hunger. This hunger was hyper-specific. It could only be satisfied by the continuous, rapid acquisition of money. When an unquenchable desire for wealth is born into a total economic void, it creates a volatile pressure that eventually forces a break from the status quo. That pressure forced him out of Rajkot and into the high-velocity markets of Mumbai. He navigated the city until he reached its financial epicenter, Dalal Street. Entering this district was a point of no return. It represented a clean break from the small expectations of his childhood. Every step toward the center of the exchange increased his leverage. He was learning how to turn a small-town hunger into a tool for manipulating the city's largest institutions. This ascent was engineered by Harshad Mehta. In time, his name would become the primary shorthand for the entire Indian stock market. He eventually reached a position of absolute dominance, becoming the largest single player on the floor. Look at the scale of these trades. While the typical investor moved in small amounts, Harshad was executing deals worth tens of millions of rupees as part of his daily routine. He secured his power by drawing capital directly from the country's banking system, using institutional funds to fuel his market moves. The mechanism was surprisingly simple. By exploiting a delay in how banks processed paper receipts, he could divert massive amounts of cash for his own use. He proved that a massive financial structure can be compromised by identifying a single overlooked gap in its daily record-keeping. But before the billion-rupee trades and the market dominance, there was a simpler reality. Strip away the legend of the big bull, and you are left with an ordinary child imagining a different life. The architect of India's largest financial scandal began as a student pedaling his bicycle to school. It is a reminder that the forces capable of shifting national markets often begin with a single person harboring an extraordinary, unchecked appetite for more. April 1992, the Mumbai stock market collapsed, wiping out 100,000 crore rupees in a single day. This crash erased the life savings of hundreds of thousands of families across India. Just one man orchestrated the events leading to this collapse, Harshad Mehta. His journey began in the 1960s, in a lower-middle-class neighborhood in Rajkot, Gujarat. The path to the largest financial disaster in Indian history began with a student navigating these streets on a bicycle. Harshad's father was a small-scale textile trader. His income was enough to cover the basics, but the family's aspirations were limited to seeing the children finish school and find steady work. Harshad was a middling student who showed little interest in his textbooks, focusing instead on a single objective, making money. He spent his school years running small-scale commercial experiments, trading cricket cards and brokering deals between classmates for tiny profits. He once asked his father how the wealthy actually acquired their riches, but his father had no answer. Observing how his father's modest wages strictly capped the family's future convinced Harshad that he needed a different path to acquire the wealth his father couldn't even explain. Harshad arrived at Mumbai's CST station in the late 1970s with zero capital and a series of high-stakes dreams. He spent his first years working in a hosiery company, a cement firm, and as an insurance agent. He grew increasingly frustrated by the low-level nature of the work, believing his potential for large-scale deals was being wasted in menial roles. He was a man searching for a specific environment that would reward his high tolerance for risk and scale. He found that environment at the Bombay Stock Exchange. He was immediately drawn to the speed and noise of the trading floor. In the 1980s, the BSE was a chaotic, manual system. Every trade was recorded by hand on paper and relied entirely on personal relationships. In a world without computers, Harshad's ability to recall complex numbers and perform mental calculations instantly gave him a massive advantage over other brokers. He gained a reputation after catching a senior broker making a calculation error and providing the correct figures entirely from memory. By 1986, he and his brother Ashwin leveraged this reputation to launch their own firm, Grow More Research and Asset Management. Harshad discovered that the exchanges reliant on slow, manual records created an opening for someone who could process information faster than the system could track it. Grow More's first major target was the Associated Cement Company, or ACC. While the stock sat at 200 rupees, Harshad identified that the company's factory assets were worth significantly more than its share price suggested. This chart shows how his influence moved the market. Within a single year, ACC shares rose from 200 rupees to 9,000 rupees. This deal turned Harshad into a celebrity, drawing a massive press following documenting his every move. The ACC deal demonstrated his ability to shift market reality through concentrated influence and calculation. However, repeating deals of this scale requires a supply of capital that few private firms could ever access. Harshad Mehta and his firm did not have the legitimate assets to support this level of trading volume. This raises the central mystery of the 1992 crash. Where did these massive funds actually come from? His secret paper trail reveals how he bypassed market limits by exploiting a systemic vulnerability within the national banking system. We're stepping out of Harshad's early days in Rajkot and straight onto the trading floor of the Bombay Stock Exchange in 1986. This was the open outcry system, a feral environment where brokers physically screamed to secure deals over the roar of the crowd. You have to picture an institution trapped in a colonial past. Inside this beautiful old-world architecture, there wasn't a single computer on the premises. That lack of technology created massive blind spots. With zero digital tracking, nobody actually knew who was buying or selling. Worse, it took 2 full weeks to physically settle a trade, leaving a massive 14-day window where literally anything could happen. Walking right into the center of this chaos was Harshad Mehta. Notice how calm he looks. While everyone else is screaming over paper slips, he is studying the board, entirely unfazed. Harshad recognized a market that was effectively blind. He stepped into a systemic vacuum where the lack of oversight meant his moves could remain invisible to the authorities for weeks at a time. Harshad did not rely on blind luck. He started with a genuine mathematical framework, developing a highly effective strategy known as the replacement cost theory. Look at this comparison chart. Harshad would look at a small market cap, represented by this tiny bar, and then calculate how much it would actually cost to physically rebuild that company's factories, land, and machinery today. If that massive physical rebuild cost outweighed the stock price, he knew the shares were deeply undervalued. He soon realized, however, that he could force that small market value bar to rise without waiting for the market. By placing massive, aggressive buy orders and generating intense hype among other brokers, he could create artificial demand, driving the stock price up regardless of the company's real assets. To execute those massive buy orders, he needed extreme amounts of capital. So he built a network of deep alliances with bank managers and politicians, using targeted favors and exclusive access to secure millions in banking funds. While his earliest trades were grounded in brilliant financial analysis, his explosive growth was now entirely dependent on manipulating crowd psychology and leveraging massive amounts of borrowed capital. By the year 1990, Harshad was generating returns that completely eclipsed every prior record on the Indian stock market. He moved his operations and life into a sprawling 15,000-square-foot penthouse overlooking the Mumbai skyline. Down in the garage, he kept a rotating fleet of 8 imported cars, Lexuses and Toyotas virtually impossible to find in India. He even built a personal cricket pitch on his property. You know you've reached the absolute peak of cultural power in India when national heroes like Kapil Dev are coming over to hang out. The financial press loved him. They crowned him the Big Bull, and Harshad happily fed the eager media machine, giving confident interviews and constantly posing for the flashing cameras. But mathematically, a hyped-up market requires constant, accelerating injections of cash to stay afloat. If Harshad stopped buying, the artificial demand would vanish, and the prices would crash instantly. His success had built an enormous trap. To maintain his empire, he needed hundreds of crores daily, a volume of cash that legitimate banking channels simply could not provide. That crushing need for daily liquidity pushed Harshad to cross a line in 1991. The standard rules of the market could no longer sustain him. To get the money, he looked at a standard financial tool, the bank receipt. As this chart shows, when banks loaned short-term cash to each other, they exchanged a bank receipt as proof that actual government securities backed the loan. Harshad colluded with a network of corrupt bank officials to print fake bank receipts. They handed over slips of paper that represented absolutely nothing, and in return, crores of real banking funds were funneled directly into Harshad's stock market accounts. This strategy relied on the total fabrication of financial instruments. By forging these receipts, Harshad committed a direct criminal act against the foundation of the interbank lending system. Harshad had found a way to siphon hundreds of crores of phantom money out of the banking sector and inject it straight into the veins of the Bombay Stock Exchange. This graph reveals the terrifying result. Driven by Harshad's phantom cash, the Sensex exploded upward by 400%, hitting a peak of 4,500 points by early 1992. The entire country celebrated what they thought was an economic miracle. Amidst the celebration, a massive hole appeared in the records of the State Bank of India. Over 500 crore rupees was missing, with no government securities in the vault to account for the outflow of cash. Journalist Sucheta Dalal began investigating this specific discrepancy. She followed the trail of the missing capital through the bank's ledgers until every lead pointed toward the accounts of a single broker. Gravity was finally returning to Dalal Street. The higher Harshad had pushed the market with phantom money, the more devastating the inevitable crash would be. Let's say you write a check for $10 million. Your account is completely empty, but the bank cashes it anyway, simply because the manager is a close personal friend. Now multiply that favor. Imagine it happening hundreds of times, across dozens of different banks, simultaneously. This actually happened. It was the exact mechanism behind India's largest financial fraud, driven entirely by a supposedly trustworthy piece of paper known as a bank receipt. Through this single paper loophole, 4,000 crore rupees vanished from the banking system. This chart shows exactly how massive that figure was in 1992. Stack that stolen money against the entire Indian national budget for that year, it consumes a full 3.5%. That is enough capital to fund thousands of real schools and hospitals across the country. A standard bank robbery hits a single vault. This operation siphoned billions directly from the pool of capital meant to fuel the country's public development, and it happened in plain sight. To understand how they did it, we have to look at interbank lending. This is a routine, healthy process where a bank with excess cash temporarily lends it to another bank facing a short-term deficit. Normally, Bank A sends cash to Bank B, receiving a bank receipt as proof of government bonds. Days later, the cash returns and the receipt is canceled. But Harshad inserted himself. Bank A handed cash to Harshad, who returned fake receipts backed by zero collateral. The banking system operated on implicit trust. They saw the official-looking paper and assumed their money was secure. Meanwhile, Harshad weaponized that trust to secure infinite, unverified liquidity, pumping the stolen banking funds directly into the Dalal Street stock market. Scaling the operation required a network of active signatures and silent lookouts, beginning with the capture of small cooperative institutions like the Bank of Karad. Harshad targeted local bank managers with absolute precision. He offered cash bribes, luxurious foreign trips, and immense personal charm, convincing these local gatekeepers to happily print his fabricated receipts. While the small branches actively printed the lies, massive financial institutions like the State Bank of India accepted them through sheer negligence. Junior officers cleared thousands of unverified bank receipts purely out of awe for Harshad's status or fear of questioning his authority. A financial loophole alone cannot siphon 4,000 crores. It requires a specific ecosystem where every gatekeeper either has a strict asking price or a willing blind spot. By 1991, the Indian economy was rapidly opening up and the stock market was booming. To manage his expanding house of cards, Harshad maintained a hyperactive daily routine, constantly shifting stolen money to cover yesterday's fake receipts. On the trading floor, he wielded absolute control. He made rapid-fire decisions, dictating enormous volumes of capital that manipulated entire sectors of the market in a matter of seconds. At night, stripped of the trading floor chaos, he was completely isolated. He knew exactly what he had built. The entire operation survived solely on unceasing forward momentum. The sheer scale of the fabricated receipt network had become a ticking time bomb. If the bank stopped lending, if the cash flow paused for even a single day, he wouldn't be able to settle the loans, and the illusion would immediately collapse. That pause arrived in January 1992. A major bank finally conducted an internal audit and discovered massive numerical discrepancies in their bank receipt ledger. Junior accountants spotted the anomaly and reported it up the chain of command. But rather than investigate the missing billions, senior executives intentionally buried the file. Faced with thousands of unbacked loans, the banking ecosystem chose silence. The institutional instinct was to protect its own reputation rather than admit they had been conned. But they couldn't suppress everyone. Late one night, a leaked phone call made its way to an outsider, someone completely immune to the intimidation of the banking elite. That call reached financial journalist Sucheta Dalal. She was about to expose the fake receipts, and in 1992, the air in Bombay was electric. India was shaking off decades of strict economic controls, and as the doors swung open to foreign investment, a wave of sudden wealth washed over the city. The architect of this liberalization was Finance Minister Manmohan Singh, whose budget signaled to the world that India was finally open for business. In the elite circles of Bombay, Harshad's name carried more weight than any movie star's. While actors sold dreams on a screen, Harshad was credited with putting actual cash into people's bank accounts. He lived with an excess that the average Indian, who was still dreaming of a basic Maruti 800, could barely comprehend. His garage housed a fleet of 8 luxury vehicles, including a specially imported Toyota Serra with gull-wing doors that stopped traffic. He owned enough cars to ensure he never commuted in the same one twice in a week. He lived in a 15,000 square foot apartment in Worli. Known locally as the Taj Mahal of Mumbai, the penthouse offered a top-down view of the Arabian Sea and the millions of people living beneath him. The social gravity of that penthouse drew in national legends like Sunil Gavaskar, who visited the indoor air-conditioned cricket pitch simply to pay their respects to the man at the top. This level of reverence makes it difficult for the public to ask difficult questions. They simply saw a financial deity capable of willing their economic dreams into existence. This chart shows the primary reason for that absolute faith. In just 2 years, the Sensex shot from 1,000 to 4,500 points. Investors pointed to the new economy to explain the surge, ignoring the reality that this upward momentum was being dictated by the actions of a single man. The market boom and Harshad's empire depended on a foundation of forged paperwork. When an entire country is watching its net worth multiply overnight, checking the math becomes a secondary concern. The mechanism Harshad used involved bank receipts, or BRs, essentially IOUs used when banks trade government securities. Harshad was acquiring huge sums of cash from banks by handing over BRs that had no backing. A network of banking officials sustained the fraud by pushing through documents they knew were illegitimate. Some were terrified of the biggest player in the market, while others were taking a direct cut of the profits. The regulatory bodies were equally compromised. By late 1991, the Reserve Bank of India had drafted internal memos noting severe anomalies in these interbank trades. Those warnings were quietly buried in filing cabinets. The silence reached the highest levels of government. Records later indicated that a delivery of 1 crore rupees in cash reached a politician, ensuring the regulatory blind eye remained shut. While the people at the top took their cut, ordinary citizens were breaking their fixed deposits and selling family jewelry to buy shares at these manufactured prices. The system protected Harshad because it was making everyone rich. As long as the numbers climbed, no one had any incentive to look at the paperwork. The fraud created a mechanical trap. To pay back a maturing fake receipt, Harshad had to extract larger sums of cash using new fake receipts. The math requires constant, accelerating expansion. If he missed one payment, the entire chain of IOUs would detonate. On television, he boasted that the market followed him, but once the camera lights turned off, he was left pacing his massive, empty penthouse alone, staring down at the city. At the peak of his influence, he had isolated himself inside a machine of his own design, one that he could no longer turn off. In February 1992, a quiet account audit at the National Housing Bank provided the first crack in the glass. An officer was reviewing a transaction where a massive sum of money had left the bank against a specific bank receipt. But when he looked for the actual securities supposed to guarantee that cash, the ledger column was blank. His superiors took the file and did nothing, but a copy of that ledger slipped through the cracks and landed in the hands of the press. Massive illusions collapse under the weight of tiny, unignorable factual errors. In April 1992, Harshad Mehta is the center of the universe at a glamorous Bombay party, oblivious to the leak. A few miles away, inside the Times of India building, journalist Sucheta Dalal is finishing a story late at night. She hits save on an article titled "The Security Scam," sending it to the printers to hit the streets the next morning. The system will gladly elevate a false god as long as the money flows, only to dismantle him the moment the math stops working. In 1991, journalism careers were built on the politics and crime beats. Banking and finance was widely considered a secondary, unglamorous assignment, a dry world of ledgers that rarely made the front page. Sucheta Dalal, however, saw the human stories and systemic risks hidden within raw financial numbers. She didn't treat the beat as a ladder to fame. Instead, she viewed her reporting as a public responsibility, aiming to make a complex financial system understandable to the common citizen. This approach earned her the trust of low-level clerks and accountants, the people inside the system who saw its flaws but couldn't change them. These insiders knew their identities would be protected, allowing her to build a network of sources that other reporters simply didn't have. The combination of a neglected sector and an invisible group of insiders provided the specific conditions necessary to uncover a massive systemic flaw. In late 1991, an anonymous tip reached her desk. The message was sparse, mentioning only a discrepancy regarding matching transactions between the National Housing Bank and small cooperative banks. The tip included 0 documents, no specific monetary amounts, and no names. It was a general direction, leaving the investigative heavy lifting entirely to her. Proving a claim that arrived with no hard evidence would require 90 days of investigation to verify. The first month was a grind through old library files and interviews with retired officials to understand the mechanics of the systems she was questioning. Active banking officials refused to answer her directly, acting as if there was a line they were terrified to cross. This diagram illustrates the mechanism revealed in the second month, the use of fake bank receipts. This tactic allowed a bank to clone a single legitimate receipt to create artificial credit out of thin air. Even after a mid-level officer confirmed the process, they provided no physical evidence. The paper trail had effectively been erased. By the third month, the transaction flow began to point to a recurring name across multiple banks, Growmore, and its founder, Harshad Mehta. As the trail led back to Mehta, indirect messages arrived suggesting she dropped the story. Her editor, Dilip Padgankar, told her that if the facts were double-checked, they would publish. Moving from a vague tip to a specific, powerful target shifted the risk of the investigation from the anonymous insiders to the journalist herself. At 6 a.m. on April 23, 1992, the Times of India reached the newsstands. The front page detailed how Mehta used fake receipts to move crores of rupees from banks into the stock market. For the first hour after publication, the city remained quiet. Then the market opened. This chart shows the Sensex falling 570 points in a single day, roughly 12% of the market's total value wiped out by the closing bell. This photograph shows the frantic scene on the exchange floor as phone lines jammed and traders tried selling to a market with no buyers. Miles away from the panic, Harshad Mehta read the paper in his office and told his staff that everything would be fine. That single morning destroyed the image of the big bull, revealing that India's financial boom had been built on a foundation of fraud. This emblem represents the institutional collapse that followed. The RBI launched urgent investigations. The National Housing Bank's governor resigned, and within a week, the state seized control of the Bank of Karad. Because the scale of the fake receipts was unknown, banks stopped trusting one another. The interbank lending system froze. But the high-level collapse had devastating consequences for retail investors who were never part of the scheme. A retired teacher in Pune saw his life savings lose 60% of their value in a week. A small-town shopkeeper who had mortgaged his business was left with a debt he could no longer pay. These citizens were the actual victims of a system that allowed a manufactured symbol of success to bypass financial reality. Sucheta Dalal began receiving calls from investors who blamed her reporting, rather than the fraud, for the market crash. Harshad Mehta responded with a confident press conference, denying the charges and claiming the fallout was a result of political maneuvering. Exposing the truth rarely fixes a broken system overnight. Often, it simply shifts the burden from those who discovered the crime to those left to survive the fallout of accountability. It is May 1992. The details of the scam are already printed in every major newspaper. Yet Harshad Mehta is free, holding a press conference with the exact same relaxed, smiling confidence he had at the absolute peak of his wealth. Facing the cameras, he offers a smooth, practiced defense. He claims he did absolutely nothing wrong. According to Harshad, he was operating entirely within the standard bounds of a stockbroker, and the sudden uproar is nothing but a coordinated conspiracy against him. Then, a journalist fires a very specific question. Did he pay off any politicians? For a fraction of a second, Harshad's practiced smile drops. He looks down and mutters that it isn't the time to answer that question. That single hesitation acted like a spark on dry grass. Within days, the rumor materialized right there on the floor of Parliament. A member of Parliament formally alleged that Harshad Mehta had personally delivered a 1 crore rupee cash bribe. The alleged recipient was a direct proxy for the sitting Prime Minister of India, P.V. Narasimha Rao. The allegation pulled the focus away from banking ledgers and onto the Prime Minister's personal integrity. Stock market fraud was now a cabinet-level crisis. And in the high-stakes world of Delhi politics, that meant every official channel of investigation suddenly lost its momentum. 6 months after the initial exposure, on November 9, 1992, the CBI finally arrived at Harshad's luxurious Worli penthouse. He walked out smiling, wearing a tailored suit. That night, he traded his penthouse for a wooden plank bed in Arthur Road Jail. But Harshad didn't stay quiet in his cell. Instead, he went on the offensive. He officially doubled down on his claim, publicly stating that he had indeed handed 1 crore in cash to the Prime Minister's office. This claim effectively held the truth of the entire investigation in a deadlock. If Harshad was lying, the state was being manipulated by a single prisoner. If he was telling the truth, the highest office was part of the crime. Neither possibility could be ignored, and neither could be easily proven. It was a brilliantly calculated gambit. By aiming directly at the absolute apex of political power, Harshad forced the government into a defensive crouch. The judicial and regulatory systems effectively froze, terrified of what a very swift, aggressive trial might accidentally uncover. Between April and December 1992, while politicians scrambled, the actual economic epicenter was collapsing. In 8 months, the Sensex plummeted from a high of 4,500 down to 2,500. When the market broke, his daughter's wedding fund was obliterated. It left him with severe stress and soaring blood pressure. In Surat, a local clothing merchant leveraged bank loans to buy heavily into the rising shares. When the prices crashed, the interest rates ballooned. Within a year, he was forced to sell his physical shop just to cover the debt. In Mumbai, a newlywed couple decided to secure their future with a 50,000 rupee investment. The resulting loss triggered endless arguments over money, suffocating their new marriage under the crushing weight of sudden debt. The fallout bypassed the trading floors and struck directly at the Indian dining table. It destroyed their life savings, ruined their sleep, and fractured entire generations. The institutional machinery fared no better. The Bank of Karad was practically hollowed out, forcing the RBI to seize control. The National Housing Bank lost so much credibility that public trust in government financial institutions evaporated for years. For ordinary citizens, this meant agonizing uncertainty. Depositors, people who had absolutely nothing to do with the stock market, found themselves standing in line for 3 straight days, desperately trying to withdraw their own savings to pay school fees. Interbank funding, the invisible plumbing that keeps cash flowing between institutions, ground to a halt. Without that cash flow, small businesses across the country were choked off from the loans they needed to operate. From his jail cell, Harshad fed his side of the story to magazine journalists. He argued that he was merely a scapegoat, insisting the real villain was a blind, negligent regulatory system that had allowed the loopholes to exist in the first place. The regulators were entirely asleep at the wheel. But Harshad's defense omitted a crucial detail. Fabricating fake bank receipts to siphon millions is a highly calculated, deliberate crime. The systemic negligence was real, but it did not make him a victim. The sheer scale of the devastation left the government with 0 alternatives. In 1992, they forcefully upgraded the Securities and Exchange Board of India, or SEBI, granting it the actual statutory power to investigate and punish financial crimes. The archaic, opaque, open outcry trading system, where brokers shouted orders across crowded floors at the Bombay Stock Exchange, was marked for death. In its place, the National Stock Exchange was born in 1994. It was designed as a direct antidote to the Harshad Mehta era, a fully computerized, transparent, nationwide network where transactions could be tracked in real time. The painful irony is that the system could have been fixed much sooner. Years later, a retired RBI official confessed that regulators knew the systemic gaps existed long before Harshad exploited them, but no one wanted to take the first step. Everyone assumed someone else would fix it. Modern India's financial safety nets are anchored in the failures of 1992. The regulatory powers of the present day were paid for by the evaporated savings and broken trust of the victims who came before. Harshad spent his final decade trapped in a legal labyrinth. He battled 27 separate court cases, constantly bouncing in and out of jail on bail. Incredibly, even while facing overwhelming legal pressure, he was still publicly recommending stocks and moving market prices as late as 2001. The labyrinth closed on December 31, 2001. At 47 years old, Harshad Mehta suffered a fatal cardiac arrest in Thane Jail. Out of the 27 massive cases brought against him, he lived to see a conviction in exactly one. The man who arrogantly believed his wealth could buy the entire Indian establishment ultimately died trapped within its walls. He took the true depths of the country's political corruption with him to the grave. Harshad Mehta faced 27 criminal cases across multiple jurisdictions. For him, this mountain of litigation functioned as a logistical fortress rather than a legal threat. The slow pace of the Indian judicial system allowed for constant procedural maneuvering. Every application faced a counterargument. Every judgment triggered a new appeal. Mehta bought time by outfunding the prosecution at every step. While in jail, he began studying legal texts, essentially acting as his own co-lawyer. He provided his defense team with detailed strategic notes, and by 1999, he was standing in court to argue his own representation before a judge. The system treats an arrest as the end of the story, but in 1992, the arrest was just the beginning of a decade-long demonstration of how wealth can successfully exhaust a fractured legal system. While Mehta's legal team fought on, members of the Security Scam Victims Association were left helpless. People like Ramesh Bai, who lost his daughter's wedding savings, spent 8 years in the courts and never saw a single rupee of compensation. Institutional accountability favored the top of the hierarchy. Junior clerks lost jobs for signing documents, while senior officers retired with their pensions fully secured. The entire saga reached a sudden, quiet end. On December 31, 2001, Harshad Mehta died from cardiac arrest while still in custody. At the time of his death, 26 of his 27 criminal trials remained pending and unresolved. The mastermind died, leaving the systemic failures that protected him and punished the vulnerable perfectly intact. The government responded with immediate structural changes. They transformed SEBI into a powerful regulator, granting it the legal authority to lead investigations and impose heavy fines. They established the National Stock Exchange to replace chaotic trading rings with a computerized, screen-based system, forcing transparency onto a nationwide market. The RBI also officially banned the bank receipt system, closing the exact loophole Harshad had exploited to move money between banks. The speed of these reforms created a sense of security. The public and the government assumed a 1992-style collapse was a relic of the past. That security vanished by 2001. Ketan Parekh, often called Chota Harshad, used the dot-com boom to pump tech stocks through artificial demand. He ignored the ban on bank receipts and instead exploited a new loophole: irregular lending from cooperative banks. In 2009, Ranalinga Raju admitted to hiding 14,000 crore rupees in fake cash balances at Satyam Computers, a fraud that had evaded SEBI and top auditors for years. By 2016, Vijay Mallya took 9,000 crore rupees in bank loans and fled to the UK before authorities could act. In 2018, Nirav Modi drained 13,500 crore from Punjab National Bank using another overlooked instrument, the letter of undertaking. This timeline shows how stolen wealth has escalated over 3 decades. Each new fraud bypasses the previous decade's reforms, with the amounts growing larger every time. The regulatory strategy in India is purely reactive. We build stronger doors only after the latest generation of scammers has already emptied the vault. The cycle survives on 4 permanent pillars. First, universal greed during bull markets makes investors ignore basic logic. Second, regulators remain proactive in theory but reactive in practice, always trailing one step behind the next fraud. Third, accountability remains selective. Low-level participants take the fall, while high-level orchestrators often remain insulated from the collapse. The final pillar is short generational memory. Every decade, a new cohort of investors arrives, unaware of the specific patterns that led to the previous crash. These 4 pillars ensure that massive financial scams remain a functioning feature of the financial ecosystem, rather than an anomaly. A few individuals work against this cycle. Journalists like Sucheta Dalal didn't stop after 1992. She continues to use independent platforms to advocate for the rights of everyday investors. Corporate whistleblowers play a dangerous role. These insiders attempt to signal fraud before it detonates, though they often face immense professional backlash for speaking out. While the institutional system is flawed, the continued vigilance of independent watchdogs is currently the only effective defense against total systemic collapse. India now has over 10 crore demat accounts. This exponential growth brings in a massive wave of young investors seeking rapid wealth. These investors share the same optimism and the same dreams as the victims of 1992. They are also exposed to the same systemic vulnerabilities. As the market begins its next climb, we face a choice. We can continue to trust the system implicitly, or we can finally start asking exactly where the money is coming from. Look at the modern Worli skyline today. High-rise towers, premium real estate, a pristine waterfront. Thousands of people live here, completely unaware that this exact ground once held the penthouse of a man who broke the Indian economy. Cities move forward. Concrete is poured over the past, and new structures replace the old. The physical evidence gets swept away, but the fractures left behind stay embedded deep within the system itself. Take the Bombay Stock Exchange building. The distinct curved tower still defines the fort area. But walk inside today and the once chaotic open outcry hall where Harshad Mehta held absolute power is completely gone. Today it operates mostly as a quiet museum piece. These physical spaces are silent. Brick and steel hold no memory on their own. History survives only through what a society chooses to document and what it quietly decides to bury. While Harshad became a household name, the physical spaces that held the immediate fallout remain stagnant. Arthur Road Jail and Thane Jail still stand exactly as they did, housing thousands of nameless inmates with pending cases, completely ignored by the public eye. Journalist Suchetha Dalal is one of the few who refused to let the fallout fade. Exposing the 1992 scam began as a professional assignment, but watching the devastation of ordinary people turned it into a lifelong, unyielding moral responsibility to hold the regulators. Then there are those who inherited the immediate wreckage. Harshad's son, Atur, lives a quiet life away from the media. His perspective frames his father not as a monolithic villain, but as a complex human being, a man capable of both immense good and profound damage. Yet the true tragedy lies in the asymmetry of our records. We meticulously document the lives of the fraudsters, the whistleblowers, and the bank officials. We build entire historical narratives around them. Meanwhile, the working-class retail investors who lost their life savings disappear from the historical record completely. History is heavily skewed. It revolves around the person who swung the hammer, entirely ignoring the people who had to rebuild their lives from the shattered glass. Labeling Harshad Mehta as either a hero or a villain is an incomplete assessment. He was a rare, dangerous contradiction, a brilliant financial analyst who also executed a massive fraud. His understanding of the market was highly sophisticated. When he invested heavily in ACC, it was driven by pure, legitimate economic analysis. He identified deep value in the cement industry that trained economists completely missed. He could articulate complex financial concepts, convincing entire rooms of seasoned bankers to follow his lead. This persuasion worked because he wasn't simply reciting a pitch. He genuinely believed his own theories. Driving this was a relatable desire. He grew up in strict poverty and desperately wanted to build wealth. The ambition to climb out of a lower middle-class existence is a universal drive. If he had restricted his operations to his legitimate analytical skills, his legacy would be secure. He would be studied today as one of the most successful, respected institutional investors in Indian history. The divergence started with a single fabricated bank receipt. In this diagram, a verified node spawns an unverified duplicate. To cover his tracks, these false documents rapidly multiplied. He trapped himself in an accelerating loop, where stopping meant an immediate catastrophic default. This raises a difficult question. Did a flawed, unregulated banking environment create Harshad Mehta, or did he actively exploit a fragile network that operated entirely on trust? The answer is both. A lack of transparency and regulatory oversight provided an open door. But Harshad Mehta alone made the moral choice to walk through it and weaponize those vulnerabilities. The fallout of those choices left an uncomfortable legacy. India's modern, highly resilient financial infrastructure exists largely because Harshad Mehta forced the Indian government to build it. Before 1992, stock trading was localized and opaque. The devastation of the scam prompted the rapid creation of the National Stock Exchange. Built as a direct countermeasure, the NSE introduced electronic trading and quickly scaled into one of the highest volume derivatives exchanges in the world. Similarly, the Securities and Exchange Board of India lacked real teeth. Today, SEBI commands significant regulatory authority with strict protocols for market manipulation, a structural power derived directly from the ashes of Harshad's collapse. On a societal level, it forced a harsh education on the middle class. Everyday citizens realized the lethal risk of blind speculation, creating a new culture of financial literacy, where understanding the asset became a prerequisite to investing. The modern Indian market is guarded by heavy armor, but that armor was only forged because the system suffered a massive, near-fatal blow. The real danger today is not another Harshad Mehta finding a loophole. The true vulnerability is the collective amnesia of the public during a relentless market bull run. When portfolios turn green and profits soar, investors actively avoid asking the one crucial question: where is this money actually coming from? In this way, Harshad Mehta serves as a permanent mirror. He reflects an uncomfortable truth about human greed, our eager willingness to ignore glaring red flags as long as we are getting rich in the process. He started as a boy from Rajkot with a completely ordinary dream. He wanted a better life. But he chose to cross a moral boundary that offered no path back, destroying himself and countless others. So instead of analyzing the historical villain, interrogate your own boundaries. Question your own complicity within the markets you trade in today. The system hasn't fixed human nature.